Welcome everybody to our session at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, and because our speakers are in the central time zone, I can't ignore that. They are 3 o'clock, just time for some coffee or tea to get that afternoon buzz. But I want to welcome everyone to the session, Recruiting Diverse Instructional Designers, University of Nebraska-Lincoln's approach to creating a more inclusive hiring process, led by Amy Ort, Beverly Russell, and Brian Wilson, from the Center for Transformative Teaching. And I'll hand it over to you three.
All right, thank you so much. And from our perspective, good afternoon, everyone, but good morning, good evening, whatever it may be where you're at. We're very excited to be here and to get to share with you today some of our experiences, as well as what we're learning in implementing a new set of inclusive search practices. My name is Beverly Russell, and I'm Associate Director at our Center for Transformative Teaching. My colleagues will introduce themselves later as they do their portion of this presentation. So let's move to the next slide. All right, so just a really quick few words about us as an organization. We are the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Teaching and Learning Center. Most of our staff is a staff of instructional designers. There are 14 of us. We are configured as a distributed team around campus. Of course, we went through a lot of changes like most everyone did during the pandemic with some of that configuration, but we're pretty much back to being a campus-based distributed team where we're officed in different colleges around campus, and we also have our centralized office where we meet periodically on a regular basis, but most of the time in those college offices. We provide, I guess, like a lot of instructional designers, one-on-one consultation with faculty and instructors, but we also do a lot of centralized programming. Our diversity, equity, and inclusion work has played out and is increasing both in an external facing aspect as well as internal facing. So externally on the campus with programming and consultations and developing resources of a wide variety of type. And then internally looking at our own organizational climate and processes, including our search processes and hiring processes, which are our focus for today. All right, so I have the first portion of the highlights that we'll be presenting today. So why did we start this? Our campus, I'm sure like many of yours, has a pretty intensive focus on inclusive excellence. Just a couple of years ago, the campus rolled out. I'm sorry, what? So a couple of years ago, our campus rolled out the new strategic goals, which they call in 2025, Nebraska 2025. A large portion of those are devoted to inclusive excellence, which play out a number of different ways. One of those ways is increasing the recruitment and retention of students, faculty, and staff from a diversity of backgrounds and identities. As part of that recruitment, obviously hiring processes would be part of that. A little over a year ago, January 2021, our campus's Office of Diversity and Inclusion developed a new set of inclusive search best practices, which they began sharing with the campus community. As soon as our unit was informed about these new inclusive search best practices that Office of Diversity and Inclusion had developed in collaboration with HR, we went through some training on those and developed or organized within our unit a small inclusive search team, which my two colleagues here and I, as well as one other colleague who's not here today, formed that little inclusive search team. And we're the ones who were tasked with looking at our organization's search processes from beginning to end, taking a look at these new inclusive search best practices and seeing how we might make changes in our processes to include these new best practices. So that's the journey that we've been on for almost a year and a half now. And in this past year, we actually had 3 searches that we'd been able to implement some of our changes in. So one of the very first things that we did, which was recommended, was to take a historical look at your positions, to take a historical look at the search data of your positions. We were kind of fortunate in terms of this didn't get overly complicated because instructional design position is the majority of our positions in our center. So we worked with HR to gather 10 years, it's supposed to be 10 years, turned out to be 11 years of historical search data around our instructional design position to see what the makeup, we wanted to look at 3 things. We wanted to look at the makeup of the applicant pool, the makeup of the short lists for each of those applicant pools, and then the demographic information of the hire. So we ended up combining the first 5 years of that data and looking at that in aggregate, because as you might imagine, some years we didn't have any searches, other years we might have had multiple searches. So looking at the first 5 years, looking at the second 5 years, going into this, we were well aware that we had had a decline in our hiring of candidates from diverse backgrounds and identities. We weren't sure why. It was something we had noticed, but it wasn't something we had paid really focused attention to. It was just of concern. The great value actually in getting the historical data was both confirming this perception we had that yes, we did indeed have a drop off of candidates from diverse backgrounds and identities, but also seeing some interesting things that we would not have known without looking at this historical data. And that was that the composition of the applicant pool stayed pretty steady demographically across those 10 years. Likewise, the composition of the shortlist group stayed pretty steady. Demographic composition stayed pretty steady across the 10 years. Much to our surprise, where the drop-off was between the shortlist and the actual hire. So we saw a significant decline in the second 5 years, the most recent 5 years of our 10-year historical data between the composition, demographic composition of the shortlist and who was actually getting hired. So seeing that, suddenly highlighted this issue for us, gave it some new urgency. We did not have the answers for this. All we could really do was speculate, but it gave new urgency to taking a look at these inclusive search best practices and beginning to implement them and address this issue from a variety of different angles. So these were the percentages that I was just alluding to in the historical data. We learned from 2009 to 2014 that 44% of the hires were non-white or Hispanic Latino. So these are using the categories that HR uses. And then from 2015 to 2020, 7% of hires were non-white or Hispanic Latino. So this gave us a concrete problem to solve. And like I said, some new urgency around understanding what was going on and implementing these inclusive search best practices. So we have integrated some Padlet questions into different points in this presentation, hoping to share some Hive knowledge here of various things that you all are doing, so that hopefully we can all learn from each other, from us sharing what we're doing discoveries we're making along the way, as well as successes we're having, how far we have to go yet, and also hoping to learn from you all about some of what you're doing.
All right. So Bev talked some about what our plans were. Now I'm going to talk about how those plans went, progress we've made so far, as well as some of the challenges we faced. So again, our goals here were to increase the diversity of the pool of candidates that we were getting, as well as to increase the diversity of the people that we actually hired. And we were using best practices from our Office of Diversity and Inclusion, as well as other things that we had come up with through our own research and experiences. So one of the first things that we did was we actually rewrote the job posting. Our job posting was relatively old, and we realized that it may contain some language that might not work very well for our goal of improving diversity, equity, and inclusion within the pool. So one of the first things we did for that was to write a unit level diversity statement and have that be the very first paragraph in our job posting. So all of our job postings include a university diversity, equity, and inclusion statement at the bottom. We wrote our own, and as you'll see when you look at the Padlet, we actually have links to the job posting. We have a link to the job posting, so you can go read it. But we wrote our own diversity statement for the job posting. Another thing that we did was we really took a long look at the language that we were using in our job posting. Like many job postings, the language was fairly sterile. It was very, for lack of a better word, corporate, I guess. It didn't have a lot of personality. We didn't use the word you. We tried to make it more warm, personal, and inviting in tone. And we started including the word you to help people sort of imagine themselves in the position, to address people directly as people. We also started using complete sentences, which is odd considering most of the people in our group are English majors. But yeah, we started using complete sentences. We removed unnecessary and limiting qualifications, and that came with just a little bit of a hitch that I'm going to talk about here in just a second. But one example of that, we stopped using one of the requirements we had before was excellent written and verbal skills. We changed that to excellent communication skills to be a little bit more inclusive in what we meant about communication. The hitch that I was talking about, we initially talked about we were going to remove master's degree as one of the preferred qualifications for our job. If I'm wrong on that, Bev, correct me. But what we learned.
Sorry, Brian, it was the specific degree areas rather than
specific degree areas.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we were going to move. Sorry, that's my fumble for today. We were going to remove the specific degree areas from the listing, but what we learned later was that makes the job H-1B ineligible, according to our university. So one effort to try and improve diversity, equity, and inclusion actually backfired a little bit. So we didn't do that. But yeah, that was one thing that we had with good intent that just was not going to work out. So the next step that we did was we really took a hard look at interview questions and the interview process. Our interview process used to consist of an interview, of a regular formal interview where we ask questions and they answer questions. And then we would also send them material ahead of time and ask them to do a formal presentation using that material to talk about how they would redesign a course. We decided to drop that presentation portion of the interview process. We felt like that might be one sticking point for people, especially who might be ESL, who may not be quite as familiar with some of the ways that we go about doing design work. So we actually moved it from that to an interview. We still sent out the materials ahead of time, the same materials that we did for the presentation, but we switched it over to asking them questions about the materials. And we actually send them an email 1 week ahead of time with the materials, as well as a general overview of our interview topics, for the first half of the interview, as well as some general idea of what we're looking for as they're analyzing that material that we're sending them. We also simplified the language in our structured interview questions. And it's funny that it took us so long to get to this, because this is something that we always tell faculty when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in teaching is, you need to take a hard look at your language and, explain yourself and maybe simplify things. We had a lot of questions that were really 2 or 3 questions in and of themselves. There was a lot to unpack, a lot of ideas to unpack in one question. When you're working with people who don't speak English as a primary language, or even when you're working with people who might be neurodivergent, that can be a real issue. I had a hard time unpacking a lot of those questions. So we really evaluated and simplified, thought long and hard about the language that we were using in a lot of our questions, and looked at it all through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. And it meant that we made we did some real gutting to our interview questions and made quite a few changes. Another thing that we did was we wrote a new search committee charge. And for those of you who don't have those or who aren't familiar with those, a search committee charge is basically just a statement from the hiring authority to the search committee. This is what I expect of you when you're doing this search. These are the criteria that you should be following. These are the expectations that I have for you. So we looked at that charge and we wrote it to include diversity, equity, and inclusion. It starts with the CTT commitment to inclusive excellence. I actually think, if I remember correctly, and I'm pretty sure the charge is one of the documents that we've included, but it includes that first paragraph that is in the position posting. It outlines a timeline and specific roles and expectations of the committee that reflect both the institutional equity and compliance, as well as HR requirements and our inclusive excellent commitments. Before, it mainly just included the IEC and HR requirements. Now we also included the expectation for inclusive excellence in the searches. It also summarizes some of our historical hiring data for the position and stresses the importance of all voices, which is also something that wasn't necessarily included in it before. Really emphasizing the importance of all voices on the search committee during the search process, and gives resources and processes if appropriate practices are not followed. And then the last thing that we did, and this is one of the questions that we have on the Padlet that I'm hoping we can get some answers from all of you. We changed up some of the job boards that we were targeting. The job boards that we specifically knew would include more diverse populations. We also put more emphasis on posting in field-specific listservs like EDUCAUSE and POD, and I don't remember if we posted an OLC or not. We also posted in some Facebook groups that specialize in higher education and ID professionals, some that we knew were going to have more diverse populations of people. So, if you've got any ideas, yep, Online Learning Consortium, thank you. If you have other ideas, please post those, because we definitely are looking for more places where we can post those. And now I will turn it over to you, Amy.
Yeah, so as you might expect, right, this is not a process that we're probably ever going to be done with. So as we started working on this, we realized there are far more aspects to the hiring process than we may have originally anticipated. There are a lot of nuts and bolts, a lot of small things to think about that could be having a strong impact. So we really do see this as a really long-term project. Some long-term strategies are involved. So this is where we would really, really love to get some kind of feedback and conversation going on. So we would love, these are kind of our long-term goals, some stuff that we're still working on. So we would really, really love to hear from folks that are maybe going through a similar process of what kind of stuff they're working on along these lines. So again, we've got the Padlet board set up with all of these different questions if you'd like to post things there. Also, feel free to drop your ideas, questions, thoughts in the chat as we're talking through this. So however you'd like to interact with this. But our first long-term strategy here is really focusing on networking. So, you know, one thing that we noticed kind of over our recent searches is that it's hard to even get applicants of you know, diverse backgrounds. And so I think what we really need to focus on is long-term networking, right? Forming connections with folks where, you know, maybe years down the line, it pays off in the form of them applying for these jobs. So, you know, this is where we're wanting to continuously evaluate where we're posting, figuring out what's working, what's not, but also really developing connections. So with, you know, grad students at our university, realizing that they're a really rich pool that down the line may be useful for us to be hiring. But also, you know, we've realized that a lot of our hires are coming kind of from other nearby universities. We're getting a lot of folks, you may have noticed this as well, folks are kind of leaving faculty roles to move into the more instructional designer, faculty developer positions, realizing that, you know, they provide a little bit more job flexibility, maybe a little bit more, you know, benefits in terms of being able to take vacation time and things like that. So building connections with folks at other nearby universities seems to be really useful at, you know, conferences like this, just kind of building those connections. So what I would love to hear from other folks, nope, Brian, go back, is what's working for you? What kind of stuff have folks been doing? So if there's anyone in here that's kind of in this process, working on it, what kind of strategies are you using to build these networks? How are you trying to recruit in diverse folks? So I guess first off, is anyone kind of in this process? Is anyone else in here kind of working on this? If you want to drop like a yes or no, if you've kind of implemented similar policies at your universities, in your departments, I'd be curious to hear it. If anyone wants to drop like a yes or no in the chat, maybe, because I know at our university we're kind of on the forefront of doing this, which is where we're not getting a lot of other folks to talk about. Oh, Brian, I'm glad you're involved in this. So maybe this is something that folks are kind of starting to think about, starting to work on. So it seems like Casey's starting to think about this, but maybe hasn't had the opportunity to implement it a lot. Yeah, making the requirements easier to reach for sure. And so, yeah, this is, again, absolutely a work in progress, something that we're trying to figure out on the fly and isn't easy to figure out. All right, now you can move to the next slide. So our second kind of long-term strategy here is the assessment part. So our intent is every couple of years to keep getting that data from HR to look at are our, you know, pools changing, our shortlist changing, to look at that data over time. And the other piece of this is we've started surveying our hiring committees after individual searches to see, did they feel like the process was fully inclusive? Did they feel like everyone was being heard? And you know, importantly, do they have any ideas for things that we can kind of change over time? So even across the few, you know, searches that we've already done, we've tweaked like the interview protocols just slightly. So this is something where we are really kind of learning and growing and changing over time. So again, we'd love to hear from other folks about, you know, are you noticing any changes in your pools over time? So, you know, we kind of have a perception that over the last couple of years with the pandemic, the pools themselves are becoming a little bit less diverse. I'd love to hear if other folks are experiencing kind of similar things, what's going on there. And then finally, next slide. you know, our third kind of long-term strategy here is just kind of, you know, the more cowbell approach. So continuing to ask questions, continuing to think about this. So making sure that we, after every search, are going through and thinking through what worked, what didn't, looking for resources. And I will say, you know, some other steps that if you look at our search process kind of checklist. So I posted a checklist of steps we've completed. There are a few other things on there that we haven't really had the chance to talk about here, but there's a few other things. So, you know, keep thinking about it, keep trying new things. Yeah, more women identified candidates making it through. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where we didn't really talk about the gender data because we got that and it looked like, yeah, if anything, it's an overrepresentation of women on our team. And yeah, that seems to be kind of a larger trend, but yeah, we're definitely more focused on trying to enhance like racial and ethnic diversity. And that's not to say that we don't care about other forms of diversity, like you know, ability, you know, hiring more neuroatypical folks and stuff like that. But HR doesn't give you data on that, so it's a little bit harder to know what those numbers look like. Yeah, Casey, I see you have your hand raised. If you're trying to talk, you're still on mute, Casey.
Zoom might be misbehaving.
Yeah, Zoom does that. So then, oh, got bumped.
Oh, I can unmute now. I'm sorry, can I still ask my question?
Absolutely.
Sorry, Zoom keeps doing that to me today. And I'm like, I get so excited and then I try to unmute and then nope. So I was wondering, so we did have a radical discussion recently, and it might not be so radical. It might just be radical at our institution of, you know, students potentially like creating like a direct pathway for like students at our institution to join, particularly like with the tech support inside of our online learning. And of course, nothing's been mapped out. And I'm sure there's like so many sections of the college that would be involved that I just don't even know about yet. But I'm wondering if anything like that has been discussed.
Yeah, I don't know that we've discussed building explicit pathways, but one thing, because our instructional designers are embedded in colleges, we kind of have our eyes out for grad students that might be teaching classes, and then when positions come open, we'll, you know, nudge them in the direction of applying. So our most recent hire was actually a current grad student in one of our education programs that an instructional designer kind of nudged them into applying. So I don't think we've really talked about a formal pathway for that, but we've definitely you know, informally are on the lookout for those folks and absolutely encourage them to apply when openings happen.
We've talked a little bit in our inclusive search team about reaching out to graduate studies and seeing how we might be able to integrate with some of their career planning sessions and to get instructional design work in there as like a higher ed option that's an alternative to the professional or the professor track rather. That's something Amy and I and our whole inclusive search team have been talking about.
Yeah, and we also have an annual like symposium on teaching, and so we're thinking about how we can get, you know, maybe some sessions specifically for grad students to kind of get them in the door interacting with us more, which might, you know, get them thinking a little bit more about instructional design as a possible pathway. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of where we're at on that.
It does, thank you.
Are there other thoughts, questions, comments? Brian, if you want to move to the last slide. That's kind of all we had in terms of a formal presentation. Again, if you look at our Padlet board, we've got all of these resources linked on there along with the slide deck. So I'll go ahead and drop that link in the chat one more time in case folks missed that. So on there, we've got 4 different resources. We've got our position description. So we've got the original one, along with kind of our new one with some annotations showing what changes we made there. We've got kind of a redacted version of our search charge document. So it doesn't have our actual data from HR on there, but you can kind of see the framework of what data we requested and how we made use of it. And then again, we've got that checklist of the different things that we've done. So we've done a few things other than the ones that we talked about today, like personalizing the rejection letter that goes out to folks. So trying to maintain a little bit better relationship with folks that, you know, maybe didn't get the job this time, but we might want to encourage to apply again in the future. Yeah, and just a few other things. And then you can also see our future steps on there of where we're hoping to go in the future. And again, if anyone has any ideas, any stuff they've been doing, or just kind of stuff they're working on, like how are y'all going about this? What kind of stuff are you doing? We would absolutely love to hear it. So with that, we'll kind of open it up to if anyone has other questions, ideas, thoughts, stuff that they'd like to talk about. We'll just kind of open the floor here. I realized we should have started this with a poll of like, where is everybody even at in this process? Casey, I saw you had unmuted again.
Yeah, so honestly, we're still, I mean, so we're a community college, but we're like the biggest one in Oregon. We're quite large. There's a lot of people that work at Portland Community College. And I think by and large, PCC has done the thing of saying, oh, you don't have to have the degree as long as you have the years of experience, right? It's like 1 for 1. But it's, I don't know, as I'm on yet another hiring committee this year for a position that I used to be in. So like, I know it really well. And it's funny when you get like super jargony because you're like, you know, geeking out over your work. And it's like, okay, let's take a step. That cracked me up about not having full sentences because that's a real thing, like, you know, but it just occurred to me that there still seems to be, and I understand the reason why it's perhaps more equitable and more fair to standardize 1-to-1, say 1 year of experience for like 1 year of study. But it just seems like people have a capacity which may not have yet been captured. And there's been a few times where, you know, I knew that someone had applied for the job that I knew they worked at Portland Community College. I knew they'd be good, but like they didn't make it through that gateway of like minimum. And so, yeah, I just kind of want to reflect on that. And it does seem like this big gap in kind of efforts. And I wonder if it's, what's the next step of evolution when it comes to that, you know, like that first gate to get through.
Yeah, and we've been thinking a lot about that, and also the, you know, even if you open up like the qualifications, so you're maybe getting a more diverse, you know, group, but you still have that preference for those candidates that, you know, do have the higher levels of qualification and happen to come in the door with a PhD. So, you know, you may end up with a more diverse pool, but you end up not hiring more diverse people just because, you know, the white people are the ones that are most likely to have the PhD, which seems to stand out a little bit more. So yeah, those are the conversations that we're definitely wrestling with as well.
Yeah, and you know, this is one, I don't remember what it was we were reading the other day. I think, Amy, you probably shared it with us, but one thing that really resonated with me was it was talking about Always try to make sure that you include 1 or 2 stretch candidates, was the way that they described it, in your short list, which is someone who may not meet as many of the preferred qualifications as other people, but you might think that for whatever reason you wanted to interview them anyway. And we've gotten to kind of a habit of determining our short list based on qualifications, like based purely on qualifications. Who we literally just like stack it up. They meet this, they meet this, they meet this. This person meets more of these things. This person gets shortlisted. And quite often we've had a lot of PhDs applying, so we've been interviewing a lot of PhDs in our first round of shortlist. I like the idea of not tossing out the qualifications, but at least thinking more about some of the people who may not have as many of the qualifications as being people who could be on your short list, and that you could get to interview them and see beyond their qualifications and meet them as people. And I mean, we've done a second round of shortlist interviews for one of the pools that we're hiring for right now, and these were people who didn't necessarily have as many of the qualifications, but wow, we found some really fantastic candidates when we were interviewing them, and when we got to hear their stories and hear the way they answer our questions. And so yeah, I definitely think we've had a little bit of blinders on when it came to just like focusing on those qualifications when it came to determining our shortlist. And I think we have to have a discussion about that at some point too.
Yeah, and whoever's behind the Peralta equity account, yeah, I like the idea of, giving people the option of giving an e-portfolio so that you can look at, some of the work they've done. So maybe, maybe they don't necessarily have the, the education, but the experience that they do have has produced some amazing work. So you can kind of, judge based on what they've really done, and less the, do you check the box of having done a certain thing for a certain number of years. Oh yeah, recommendation letters, Monica. That's a whole nother can of worms. And yeah, that's one of the things that, we've kind of talked about, because as a staff position, we don't have actual recommendation letters. We just kind of do reference checks. And we do actually do that after we have done the job interviews, so that those kind of play less of a role. So it's more kind of checking the boxes of like, does it seem like this person is who they say they are? Does it seem like they actually have the qualifications that they say they do? So giving those references a little bit less power, but yeah, I agree that those are rough all around.
Yeah, I mean, I brought it up because I mean, it's really hard to, this whole session I've just been listening. I was supposed to help moderate, but you all are awesome, by the way. Do it all. But it's I was thinking about it. It's really hard to have, a pool. It's exactly what someone just said a minute ago, when the applications aren't there. And that's why I always preach inclusivity first, because until we get to the inclusivity piece, it's hard to get to the diversity piece at our levels when, and I hate that. I hate it. And, even for me, when I was hired, everybody, like not everyone, but I had a few people saying, oh, you got the job because you're a brown woman. Like, oh, okay. And it, it's hard for us too. So I was just saying, and I don't know, part of it, it's really, I struggle with it when I am on the hiring committee now, because I don't want anybody to have those comments, and so I was thinking about what are some of the things, the rec letters, we have this thing about academia. Oh, I have a recommendation letter from someone at Harvard or someone at UC, whatever. And that's beautiful. And that's great. But unfortunately, the way I grew up, I didn't know those people, and so that means a lot of the people that are applying to our colleges, I wonder sometimes if they don't even try, because they don't even think they can get such letters. Anyway, I'll be quiet.
No, those are excellent points. And that, that was part of what we were trying to do when we were rewriting the job posting, is making it clear that like we want you to apply, and don't feel like you have to have the super high qualification. It's worth it to try. But it's hard to get past that mentality, especially people that have been burned so many times in the past. It's like, oh, these people talk a big game, but like, are they actually going to follow through? And also, I'm looking at your website, like, am I going to be the only non-white person? And am I actually going to like feel like I fit in this space, even if they do hire me? So yeah, there are a lot of obstacles here, and I don't have a lot of answers, but I'm happy to build a space to talk about it.
Yeah, our geographic location is definitely one thing that, being in Nebraska, is one of the problems that we have that we can't necessarily fix. There's a lot of misconceptions about Nebraska, and there's some that are kind of accurate, but yeah, so it can be hard sometimes to convince people, why would I want to move to Nebraska if I'm not white? And I completely get that. I absolutely get that. So, I mean, I am white, and I honestly questioned if I wanted to move to Nebraska or not, but Bev talked me into it. Well, no, she kept me here.
Don't blame me. It's actually a fantastic place to be. I think I'm from the East Coast, and I've now been here a long time. I was very pleasantly surprised. It's a wonderful place to be. So part of it's getting that out to people too. We all have preconceptions about what places are, but I think you've seen from this presentation too, and I'm sure all of you are experiencing, like, we had some short-term things we could do and that we're still in the midst of doing. It's very gratifying, really, to be able to make changes, to look, to watch, to see what kind of impact they might have, hoping they might have impact. But then there's also these more tenacious issues that are the longer term. Like, there's been some discussion here about the relationship building, the networking, the overcoming of distances. So some of those things that continue to impact, no matter what those short-term implementations you can make, like changing the posting and even looking at our historical data and things like that. There's these bigger things, the networking, the relationship building, the building up of Nebraska for us that are a little bit longer term challenges, but they're all interwoven. So, we don't want to get discouraged about it. Another interesting point, I know we're probably going to run out of time, and I think this kind of touched on some, is like, balancing like institutional requirements around searches. So with some of this, like, we've been talking about minimum and preferred qualifications, and absolutely we have to have those. They have to be articulated and documented. And when we send in, probably like all of you, our search list to, or sorry, not our search list, our short list to IEC for like review and approval before we can move forward with interviews, part of what they're checking is that, we've rationalized the choices that we've made for that short list. And some of that is those check boxes in terms of minimum qualifications and preferred qualifications. So when we've been talking here some as a larger group about flexibility and what other kinds of ways you can look for candidates having the knowledge or having experience that would substitute for the knowledge, for us to get that accepted, like, we would have to make a change in the documentation of the minimum or preferred qualification. And then that requires a lot of thinking through how to do that and what that looks like. And a sort of connected conversation I was having with a colleague recently about this is, talking about people, and this plays into conventions and perhaps conventions from different sectors when it comes to employment. So, some applicants, we all know this, right, really touch on those minimum quals, like we're looking for them to in their cover letter and in their resume. They address them. That makes it so much easier for the search committee to go through and, oh yes, you've got this, you've got this, you've got this. some are really good about doing that, others aren't. And you don't ever know whether that's because they didn't bother and they threw out this whole bunch of applications, or whether, you know what, they didn't realize in higher ed, it's serious to address those minimum quals and preferred quals in your cover letter, in your resume, to show that you actually have that. Whereas in some other sectors, maybe you don't necessarily have to touch on every one of them, but the people doing the hiring are kind of looking at this whole picture of the applicant. And if they see some of them, they're interested, they'll bring you in for an interview. Thus thinking some of these applicants may not realize they are literally disqualifying themselves if they don't address this in the, like I said, in their application materials. And so a colleague and I are having this conversation about, I'm sure all of you can relate to this, about how much guidance and direction do we give in our own postings to try to perhaps lower some barriers on this. Like, should we come right out and say in a couple of sentences, please be sure to address each of the following minimum qualifications in your materials? We were actually talking about this, whereas you know, we can all, right, imagine some people who might be part of a search committee or affiliated processes thinking, wait a minute, you know, are you spoon feeding this? Like, these people are professionals. Shouldn't they know, you know, the conventions of this, that the expectations, I should say, you're applying for a job, you're reading closely, you're taking this seriously, you're addressing these points. Are you spoon feeding if you come right out and say, make sure you address the following, you know, in your application materials? So there's been, yeah, just some interesting conversations. I mean, in one way you can think about it the way we've talked about for students, particularly first-gen students, you know, the hidden curriculum. I mean, there are some parallels there in a way with, you know, hidden maybe search expectations, particularly for certain types of jobs and in certain sectors. So this is generating lots of conversations and rethinking about what barriers, maybe even hidden barriers to us, we're not aware of that are impacting this, you know, our applicant pools.
Yeah, so I think we're pretty much out of time now, but please, like, if you have any questions, thoughts, ideas, you can email us. Our contact information is on the slides, or post your questions, resources, stuff in Padlet so that we can all kind of learn from each other here. Thanks, y'all.
Thank y'all.
We'd like to thank the team from University of Nebraska-Lincoln for a great presentation, but also a great conversation, because I really liked how you pulled in what everyone else is doing and thinking and exploring, and you've given us plenty of ideas to do that on our own campuses. So as they mentioned, there is a Padlet out there for those of you watching the recording. We'll hope you'll jump in there to share your ideas and resources and questions, and we'll create that as a community space to keep this conversation going throughout the week and beyond. For those of you who are getting ready to transition into our next session, we have about 12 minutes. So we're going to stop the recording. We'll have some playful banter and chit chat, but it won't be anything formal until maybe about 10 minutes from now.